Edwin Armstrong was one of the greatest pioneers for broadcasting. Wikipedia regards him as the most prolific and influential inventor in radio history, and PBS says he is the father of modern radio. So why isn't Edwin Armstrong as popular as radio innovators such as Sarnoff, Marconi, and Lee DeForest? Here, we will show how a man who is the holder of 42 patents and 3 breakthrough inventions has continuously been undermined as a victim of the public relations game and the battles he had with those who were threatened by his inventions. Born on December 18, 1890 in New York City, Edwin Armstrong was raised in the Chelsea district, an area that centered much of their culture on the church. At the age of 8, Howard contracted a disease that was known as St. Vitus' dance, which caused him to be withdrawn from school for 2 years, and he often played alone, leading possibly as a factor to his reserved and serious personality. Education was an important part in his life, and learning was always praised because many of his relatives were teachers. Often, family members would quiz Howard like, "Quick boy, how much is 9 times 5 minus 3 divided by 6 times 2 plus 9?" to encourage his mental agility. By the age of 14, Howard knew all there was to know about wireless. In 1909, Armstrong enrolled into Columbia for electrical engineering. He never took things for granted and always wanted to know why things were as his professors were telling him. He often questioned their assertions with a self-confidence that was sometimes mistaken for arrogance. In contrast to many inventors, Armstrong had a distinctly analytical mind. Instead of working by trial and error, he would proceed methodically toward identifying the root cause of a problem in order to find a path towards a solution. He delighted in plunging into areas that others had pronounced hopeless, and he did so with a single-minded determination.
While Armstrong was still a student in Columbia University, he invented the regenerative radio in 1912. It was licensed later in 1914, which helped develop radio into a dominant mass medium and also provided positive feedback. The regenerative radio allowed electronic signal to amplify several times by the same device. Edwin Armstrong and Lee DeForest found themselves both competing for the audience. Armstrong made the audio work better and improved it by amplifying it and making it possible to prompt positive feedback. Edwin Armstrong was able to achieve very high levels of gain and listen to distant signals that wouldn't have been previously possible. Since Armstrong had already studied the audio years before, it made it easier for him to understand DeForest's invention. As soon as DeForest found out Armstrong's idea was working well and people started appreciating Armstrong's work on the audience, DeForest began to say he was the one with the whole idea. Armstrong and DeForest fought back and forth for several times. At first, Armstrong had won against the legal proceedings DeForest had insisted on. After many appeals, DeForest ended up winning in 1934 at the U.S. Supreme Court. Although DeForest won, the scientific community favored Armstrong as being the one who bettered the audience.
World War I was a global war that lasted from 1914 to 1918 and was held mainly in Europe. The United States tried to remain neutral, but ultimately President Woodrow Wilson decided for U.S. to join because he felt that America has a role to ensure that the world is safe for democracy.
After Armstrong invented the superheterodyne radio in 1914, he was assigned to develop a device that could detect enemy radio signals. The superheterodyne receiver had an 8-valve, a first detector heterodyne oscillator, 3 stages of intermediate amplification, second detector, and 2 stages of audio amplification. The superheterodyne radio used many more valves than any other receiver. So in 1917, Armstrong was invited to join the U.S. Army Signal Corps with the rank of captain and was sent to Paris to help set up a wireless communication system from the Army. Another innovation by Armstrong was the super regenerative receiver in 1922. He developed this invention when there was war in Europe. Just like the regenerative radio, Wikipedia states that the super regenerative detector found several highly important military uses in World War II in friend or foe identification, equipment, and in the top secret proximity fuse. This invention used only 3 vacuum tubes. It was proven that this invention wasn't as useful as his other inventions, but it is known for the excellent sensitivity for little amounts of power. Today, it is used for garage door openers, wireless networking devices, walkie-talkies, and toys. The super regenerative is the most common radio used in our world today.
Shortly before his invention of the super regenerative receiver, Armstrong met the president of RCA, David Sarnoff, at a boxing match in 1920. Eventually, Armstrong married Sarnoff's secretary, Marion McGinnis, in 1923. At this point, Armstrong was a millionaire. Not only did Westinghouse pay hundreds of thousands for the rights to the superheterodyne, but Armstrong also made a similar deal with RCA for the super regenerative receiver.
In the 1920s, FM was introduced but rejected. People tried to reduce the noise of radio communications transmission, but eventually gave up. So Armstrong took this challenge and got FM working in 1933. Armstrong took the idea of using FM, but his idea was to use a wider bandwidth to reduce the level of noise. It took Armstrong a couple of years to prove that the use of wideband FM would reduce the level of noise. Armstrong started showing that his idea of lowering the noise was working by arranging a broadcast transmission from the house of a local friend to the RRE conference. The radio transmission lowered the level of noise and demonstrated that Armstrong's idea was fulfilling.
In 1934, Armstrong began working for RCA at the request of Sarnoff. Although Sarnoff was impressed with the FM system, he didn't support it because he had already invested too much in AM. So Armstrong went ahead and licensed it to smaller companies. It garnered a lot of positive reviews because FM radio worked better in sound and signal than AM ever did. RCA tried to lobby that FM should be limited to only TV, but failed. Then they tried to strike a deal with Armstrong to use his patents but pay no royalty, which Armstrong refused.
During World War II, everybody used FM in the war, but Armstrong let the military use it royalty-free. At this time, RCA and other radio companies convinced the FCC to move FM to higher frequencies, which gave a huge setback to Armstrong's radio network, because they couldn't afford the change. Then RCA claimed to have a patent on FM radio, and this began a slew of copyright infringement lawsuits from Armstrong.
Broken, beaten down from financial obligations to legal fees and research, Armstrong's frustration escalated to the point where his wife left him, and consequently to his suicide in 1954.
I can't believe they think they're going to get away with this. Those thieves!
Hey, Laura, it's gonna be okay.
You don't know nothing!
I'm done with you.
Oh my god, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen. I'm so sorry. I'm broke. My wife left me. Everyone keeps stealing my ideas. There's nothing left to live for. Marion, I'm so deeply sorry. I have always loved you.